Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The most interesting article I read regarding the prison escape at the Clinton Correctional Facility was a letter to the editor of the New York Times. It wasn't about the men who escaped, but rather it was about the ones inside and their families. It raised so many things I'd like to talk about. My guest today is Asha Bandele, the writer of the letter and the author of The Prisoner's Wife, a memoir. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Ronnie.
You're welcome. I was so touched by your letter.
It's
so interesting. All the coverage was where they're investigating all the stuff they're doing. And you wrote a letter in response to the lockdown, which was causing great consternation and fears with the people, families of outside of the men who were in there. You talked about the need of family support. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I was married to somebody who was incarcerated for 15 years or so. And, you know, in thinking about the support, not only do I realize the kind of safety in many ways it provides for the prison, because there's as families do out here, right? It provides stability, it provides a sense of hope. Families give us love, of continuity. So not only do you disrupt that for the men who are inside, but for all of the folks who are outside, including the more than 3 million children who go to bed every night with a parent who's incarcerated. And, you know, those phone calls home are the thing that often stabilize the children, to keep them connected. 2/3 of all parents who go to, or fathers that is, who go to prison are involved in their children's life at the point that they're arrested. So the sort of idea that these are just sort of some disconnected from their community folks who are doing time in prison like they fell out of the sky from nowhere, it's just not true.
And it makes so much sense, too. The word that always struck me was hope, because it gives hope to the person who's incarcerated that he's going to get out. We're talking about he now. And to the family that they're going to have the person back. But it's been documented all over. I mean, all the studies and everything show the recidivism rate of people who have strong family support is much less than the general population, right?
Yes, that's absolutely
right. And the prisons are overcrowded mostly because of the recidivism rate.
Well, that's absolutely right. And we see that, you know, the people here in our own communities out here who are disrupted the most are disrupted because they've somehow been disassembled from their own families. You know, the biggest number of young people who go into prison are actually not children who've had a parent in prison. It's actually children who've been in foster care, because there's a disrupt in the family structure. You know, we say in my own community, you know, children need roots and wings, right? You give them those roots, they're going to fly. And when you start pulling that apart at every single moment, it's hard for them to fly, to soar into their own dreams, to be who they might be. And so in doing that sort of lockdown, you know, I wondered if we know, as we do know, that families provide structure and security for even the guards who were there. Why do you do it? And I think it's to exert a control.
What it was in answer to, I don't know if we said that, was there was an article the day before about how the lockdown had affected the communication, that they could have no more phone calls. I think the mail was disrupted, everything. So it was this blank wall and the anxiety on both sides of telling the person outside, and especially the person outside, worrying about what was happening to their loved one there.
That's right. So they're totally, I mean, imagine the fear that creates inside the prison, the tension that creates inside the prison. And where does that go when eventually that lockdown is lifted, right? All these people have been treated so badly. And who benefits from that? So we have to remember that they've probably also been locked out of a certain amount of news. Now they don't have news from home. They don't have news from their families. And the reality is they don't need to do that. Yeah. The reality is you can keep a prison secure without completely isolating the men who are in there or harming their families. We know that solitary confinement, which is really what it almost becomes, is a form of torture. We know that. We're looking at solitary confinement in our nation. We just saw the horrific suicide of young Khalif Browder.
Yeah.
Right. So for many, they find that if you don't go into solitary confinement with an emotional or mental disrupt, you certainly come out with one in very many cases, because it's one of the cruelest forms. We're human beings. Yeah, we're tribal creatures. We're not crocodiles, sort of crouching alone in the shadows.
You're right about it. Your husband was taken to solitary, but he had somebody else in the room, right? A stranger in a tiny room.
That's right.
That wasn't the major thing. I didn't know when I first read the letter that you were such a wonderfully talented author.
Thank you.
So once I started this, I just couldn't put it down because it spoke so much of what happens inside these institutions. And it's always been a question, why do we let society do these things? I mean, why do we is it because we're such a vindictive society? What are we?
Well, you know, the way that I would look at it, especially when first of all, we don't lock up everybody. We lock up a certain group in society, and that's primarily black men have been the folks who have been most impacted by that, although the numbers for black women are skyrocketing, 800% in the last 15 years or so. But I think that if we look at the relationship of black people to this nation, it's always been one of control, confinement, containment in some way. And so we go from a system, as Michelle Alexander has written about, we go from a system where black people were contained by slavery and then by the laws, the black codes that followed that and the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan, then to Jim Crow, which forms the basis of what they used in South Africa for apartheid, we remember. Right? Then to the Jim Crow laws. The moment you get the Jim Crow upended in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, by 1971 you have Richard Nixon coming right in with the war on drugs, which is used as the vehicle to contain massive amounts of people. In the last 40 years since the war on drugs, we've incarcerated more people than we have in the entire history of this nation's republic, making the United States. And
in the world.
The United States incarcerates more people. 5% of the world's population we have here and 25% of its prison population.
So it brings us to the discussion that the president just is trying to have. It's all the race, right? It's so terrible. But it's more because it's got some disruption of laws and what we do, but the way we handle it is not really the way a civilized society should, I don't think.
No, it's true. And you can make anything illegal. You can make absolutely anything illegal. It used to be illegal to stand on corners. Those were called the black codes, right? It was called vagrancy, right? So you can make anything illegal. If you look at a country, and so here we took drugs, and not only were they illegal, because drugs weren't always illegal. We want to remember that, right? In this nation, they weren't always illegal. In the late 1800s, when you had white women who struggled with opioid use, heroin, what was our response? Community wrapped its arms around that woman. We saw whatever she was struggling with. We took care of that. It was beautifully documented in the film by Eugene Jarecki, The House I Live In. So, you know, it was only when you introduce the question of race in 1915 and on do you start locking up massive amounts of people, and only in the 1970s does it become this incredible policy. And when you have that many people locked up, that's not about an individual failure. That's about a policy position about who's expendable and who's not. And so really, you know, I would say since 1998, certainly there's always been prison reform and prison abolition movements, but in 1998, many of us came together at the call of Angela Davis in Berkeley, California. 3,000 of us gathered in the Berkeley Mountains, as it were, and really called for a questioning of what we call the prison industrial complex. And is prison always the right response, right? As I wrote in the letter, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean everything is a nail.
Right.
Doesn't mean everything's a nail.
Yeah.
And if we look at a place like, for example, Portugal, where you have drugs decriminalized, you don't have an increase in drug use, you have higher rates of positive health outcomes, the AIDS rate has dropped, the new infections of HIV rates have dropped, Hep C has dropped, and you don't have an increase in crime, and you have some drop in drug use.
And you speak of that with great authority because that's now your professional life, right?
It is. I'm very honored to run the grants program, the Advocacy Grants Program for the Drug Policy Alliance. It's a national organization, but headquartered here in New York. We have about 70 staff, and so we work on questions like this. And I think, you know, some people call us the legalizers, and there's a lot of questions out here. But really what we're looking at is America adult enough to have a conversation about drugs, which have been in every society since time immemorial. Drugs have always been here. How are we going to live with them is the question. What we've determined thus far is that we're going to live with them by locking people up, by not providing treatment on demand if somebody wanted it, or by compelling treatment, right, for people who may not even really need it.
So I want to go back to the prison industrial complex.
Okay.
Except that, I mean, people will say to you, well, the Rockefeller drug people are out of prison.
That's not true, though.
It's not true. And also drugs affect behavior. Doesn't that contribute to crimes?
Well, you know,
It didn't necessarily come under the Rockefeller drug law, right? Am I wrong?
Well, I think that there's a wonderful book out by a brilliant neuroscientist named Dr. Carl Hart. He's up at Columbia University. He had a great book come out a couple of years ago called High Price. And what he looked at there, because he went into neuroscience to end the question of addiction, and he had seen crack addiction take over his community as he was growing up. And what he found when he did real-world experiments, first he did it with rats, right? So what would happen if would a rat just go for the crack every time you gave it? They didn't every time. If you introduced a sweet treat, if you introduced a sexually receptive female to that male rat, they had a little choice. They often made the other choice. The same thing. Then Carl said, what do I do if with people? And what we found with people who were active crack users, right, the most insidious drug, we were told, the thing that destroyed black communities, is when people were offered choices, they did not always go to choose crack, and most of the times they chose something else. And so I make that point to say that we should not look about what's put into our communities so much as we should look at what was taken out. And what was taken out in the 1980s? Think about Reagan coming in and saying that ketchup was a vegetable. So you don't have good food for the majority of children who are in public schools. You have a disrupt in housing, right? And you have a policy position on that. Your former boss, Mario Cuomo, takes $500 million out of monies that were meant to secure low-income housing and puts it into prison building. You have jobs taken out. And once you have all of these things taken out, do people come undone? With, on top of that, drugs in the community? Sure. But what we find is that the majority of people who use drugs, fully 80 to 90%, are paying taxes, are raising their families, do not become addicted. That's what we find. I mean, they may even become president, right?
Right.
Few of them already have, right?
And they can be white.
And they can be white. The majority of crack users are white.
Right. So let's go back to the prison. You talked about the industrial complex. And one of the things that hinders that family support is the distance of prisons from where the home is. And that's because those prisons have become the economic engine of those towns, right?
That's absolutely right.
So any time that we try to change it, we've got a union and we've got all the upstate people coming countering it. Is that true? Yeah,
that's of course. You have towns that have been deindustrialized, and so the prison is the economic heartbeat for generations going on. It's where you grow up, you work in the prison, you retire from the prison into your little home. And so the work that we have to do as advocates is to reimagine a world where we're punishing people, where confinement isn't our knee-jerk response to things, right? Because certainly we don't want those towns to be disassembled. When I was going up to them, there were, and this isn't even in the most northern reaches of the country. I've been up to Clinton, and Rashid, my husband, did time in Clinton. But even in the towns that were a little closer to our beautiful New York City, our fancy New York City, when you got into that town, I'm telling you, it would be like leaving 1995, which is about the years that I was going up, and entering 1940. And as though nothing had changed. The movie theaters, or 1950 maybe, the movie theaters looked old, the cars look old. We often talked about Cuba sort of being stuck in the 50s. Go to upstate New York.
So you talk about waiting for the buses. I love that. Because we always, my husband used to write about the lines. He'd say, you come out from Lincoln Center glittering with all your jewels, and you see these people, and you say, oh, how nice, they're going on a ski trip. But they weren't going on any ski trip. They were going on 8-hour, 9-hour rides to prison, right?
I saw that for years growing up. You know, I'm a native New Yorker.
Your family lived near there.
Absolutely. I grew up in Lincoln Towers, right near, grew up going to Lincoln Center, and I would see all the women in lines, as I got a little older and could be out that late, I would see the women in lines at midnight, and I would think, it's a casino trip. You think all of these things, because we hide this away. We hide away what we actually do to our fellow human beings.
The buses got moved because they didn't want them there.
That's right. Once they got rid of the old Coliseum and they wanted the Time Warner Center up there, it was glittering and beautiful. All of that was gone, but I think one of the most interesting things or painful things that I saw growing up was when I first, or growing up within this reality, was when I first started going up to the prisons. The guy who I worked with or drove up with had one 15-seater van. By the time I completed that tour of duty, if you will, I think he had two full, 50-seat buses and a couple of vans, and you would see that. You just saw the explosion in the 1990s.
So you were, you went up to the prison to read your poetry.
Yes.
To help in a class.
It's right. I was studying. I was a political science major at Hunter College. I'd go, rah, Hunter, go CUNY. So, and we had a professor who had been a former member of Cuomo's parole board, Ted Kirkland, and we went up initially to the prisons because we were studying the impact of the prison industrial complex on Black America. We went up, and I met the man who would become my husband. Not that I thought about that then. And then I continued to bring young people up because for me, coming from the Upper West Side and living a fairly rarefied life, you know, I didn't think about people in prison, as most of us don't, who haven't had that incarceration, or maybe many of us now are starting to. It becomes
almost seductive, doesn't it? Because it's somehow a comment on our whole society and civility or something. I don't know what it is, but you really want other people to know what's going on in there, I think.
I did. I didn't want to see. I know what happens when you other people, when you call them by names not their own.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We know that. We saw that in Nazi Germany.
And that's because they have numbers.
That's because they have numbers. That's because we call them any name that isn't their own. An inmate, a convict, a felon. We call them so many different names that dehumanizes them. When the one thing that's true about people always have all these truisms about everybody who's in prison, but here's the one absolute truth. They're all human beings, every single one of them, and we don't call them by that name. We call them by numbers, or we call them by these names we make up, and we've seen what happens. As soon as you start doing that, it becomes much easier to remove their humanity. It becomes much easier not to see that as some mother's son, some father's daughter.
Right. It's so discouraging because there are so many things that deter people from wanting to go, and also that further, I think, emphasize the punishment that people think they're giving. I don't. The treatment of the guards, the treatment of visitors. I mean, you talk about how the long wait. I mean, I remember when after you had the baby, your wonderful, adorable daughter, you write that the guard wanted to stamp her hand. How old was she?
Oh, she was weeks.
I mean, it's so crazy.
Weeks.
Anyway, you know. So, I know I don't want to take you back to that, but I do want people to know what it's like, because I don't think unless they do, we're really going to get the changes that I'm
going to try not to cry, as I haven't thought about that in a long time.
Yeah.
But, you know, I remember arguing with them about you don't stamp a 2-week-old baby's hand because babies put their hands in their mouth.
Yeah.
I remember arguing with guards about how many bottles I could have over a 6-hour visit. They sort of predetermined. You know, there were so many ways that they humiliate and discourage, and yet that is somehow preferable to what many prisons are doing now, which is wholly removing the opportunity for families to visit. And this is what happens in the whole private prison industry by having just virtual visits. And there's something about human touch. It means something when someone reaches across the table and touches your hand. It's important to us. It allows us to remember that we are connected to one another in a family, in a common human family. And so I worry about the rise in private prisons and that want to do this stuff on the cheap. And so it becomes cheaper to have these virtual visits where you're sort of getting on a screen. And while, you know, technology can be used to certainly elevate us as a nation, it can also be used to further separate, divide, and diminish us as human beings, right? And so I worry about that.
In the past, we've talked about the parole hearings are now virtual hearings of the parole board. You sit in a room and the parole board is, you're talking to the screen. But it's all dehumanizing. That's the problem.
You don't have to look at a real person in their face. I mean, many of the people who are in prison, even ones who did, you know, something absolutely heinous, many of them are now, you know, they were 16, they were 15 years old, you know, still, and at an age where they're extraordinarily susceptible to peer influences and just bad choices. Bad choices. The frontal cortex isn't developed. That impulse control, that ability to make good decisions, that's not developed. Not developed.
So do drugs play a role in that kind of, in murders and stuff? Are there statistics about that people who get into really bad crimes have been on drugs?
You know, I don't know those statistics about how much, but I'd be willing to bet you. I would be willing to bet you that the drug, if we parsed it out, and this is just my own sense, and I don't have any data here, would be that the drug you'd find would be alcohol.
That's
I'd be willing to bet that it's probably alcohol. What do people do if they smoke weed? I'm not a weed smoker, but what do people do? You sit back, you kind of relax.
Yeah.
Right? And then you have to think about the drugs themselves are sort of neither good nor bad. They just are. Right? So there's a lot of things that go around that gets people to behave a certain way. Often I think it's played up in the news, right? He was a pedophile and he was smoking meth. But the majority of meth users are not pedophiles, right? So that just happened to be something that was in his narrative, right? That he smoked meth. But the fact is that he was a pedophile, and somehow we equate the fact of pedophilia or rape or violence with the drug use when the majority are not doing that. The majority of people who are using drugs are getting up and taking care of their families and going to work and paying taxes. And we know that intuitively. Think about all the cocaine that was used on Wall Street.
Right.
Think about all that cocaine. What did they do? They went, they made a lot of money. People were very happy with them. Think about all of the military folks we have who are using amphetamine so they can go along. They're giving them. Right? Think about so drugs are neither good nor bad. They just are. And it's sort of everything else that's around people that may be the actual determining factor. I don't know that drugs are necessarily the variable that shifts someone into criminality, right?
That's really interesting. You just mentioned about pedophiles, and I just wanted to say that I talked about that a couple of weeks ago, that the majority of the people on the sexual offenders list are not pedophiles.
That's right.
So it's a whole. We just generalized everything, and that's always too bad.
That's right.
So what would we do to have helped those women who were waiting to hear from the men, or the men who were waiting to talk to the women, or what do we do about these prisons?
There's so much work that's being done right now by many, many fine groups. Drug Policy Alliance, of course, my own tops the list, but there's also an extraordinary effort being put forward by the ACLU. On that front, and then all of the grassroots groups across the nation who have been calling for this. Legal Services for Prisoners' Children out in California has been a leader.
How do we get these legislators to hear them? I mean, here we have, I'm working on clemency. I want the governor to start giving clemencies. I want to see people serving shorter terms, or certainly not getting hit at the end of a term and having to stay in prison. But who do you talk to? How do you get that? I know all these wonderful groups are working, but we've got to break through. And
I think we're starting to do that, Ronnie.
I'm glad to hear that.
I think we're starting to do that. If I look at what Hillary Clinton offered in her very first turn out the gate, her first big policy speech, her husband following right after talking about I'm sorry because the things that Bill Clinton did to expand the prison industrial complex were about as bad as any politician could get. So these questions are being raised now in the highest offices, and we have to keep raising them. Our mutual friend, Ira Glasser, always reminds us that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, and we have to keep pushing the question. When I was telling you about this letter to the editor, I was exhausted. It had been a long weekend of writing. I also work as a journalist. I was working on something for Essence magazine on the drug war and mass incarceration, and then I said, I didn't want to do the letter. I was tired. But I said, let me take 2 minutes and tell the truth that I know. And I sat down for 10 minutes, and I wrote that letter, and it had an impact, both so that I'm here today, but also other folks have contacted me since then. We have to do what people in time immemorial have done, which is keep speaking truth to power. Where we have a moment to write a letter, if that's our skill, we do that. Where we have a moment to stand and rally and raise our voices, we do that. Where we have that kind of in, because we have that sort of authority to get in with the grass tops folks who are legislators, we whisper in their ear. We say it wherever we can say it, that it's not acceptable that 2.2 million Americans are living incarcerated, that it's not acceptable for the United States to lead the world in incarceration, that it disrupts our democracy. It makes it a failed experiment in democracy. We say it everywhere we can.
I feel as if I'm on the defensive, but I really just totally agree with you. And it goes to how do we tell people that they are effective when they do this? How do we develop policy that is developed with the people who know most about it and listen to them? How do we? It's all part of also the money part and the corporate interests and the different. I mean, like the telephones. For a long time, the telephone I mean, first of all, there were, I don't know if there still are, kickbacks when companies do the telephones in prisons. All of these things that happen. So you feel that we really can make a change. I mean, I've always believed that for many years, and I've seen a lot of changes, I guess.
Yeah.
But you get impatient.
You do get impatient because you know that what's happening is not what's supposed to be happening. And you know that not only could there be another way, but there has been another way. We have had another response, right? We had another response when we saw communities in crisis and we needed to get in there. We called it the New Deal, right? And we had the 3 R's. Was it reform? I can't think of the 3 R's of Roosevelt as I'm sitting here.
4 freedoms.
And
freedom from fear, want.
Well, we won't do the list today, but you know, we got in there and we said it was reform, recover, and something like revive, right? And reform, recover, and something, repeal or revive. But what we knew was that we had to at first take care of those who had been most harmed by the Great Depression. Right? So how do we do that? How do we take care of people and communities who have been disassembled by the prison industrial complex and our desire to put all the money into prison building and not into community restoration? Restore is the other word. Restore. All right. And then how do we look to repair those communities in such a way? So we want to relieve their pain. Right now, relieve it. We want to restore them to a place that's whole, and we want to reform our laws so that we never are in this place again. Those are the questions that we should be asking, right? And we have some very smart people, whether it's Paul Krugman from the New York Times, bringing in the brilliance of his economic policies, the greatest thinkers, many of them are in this nation and we have access to. And I think working together, we can figure out how to not just undo what we've done, but to create something better. Yes.
Well, we've come to the end of the program, and there couldn't be a better end to it. So, Asha Bandele, thank you so much. And I'm so glad I read the letter, and I'm so glad I met you.
I'm so glad to have been here. You've been a shero of mine for a long time. You have.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.